I want you to start by just imagining something for a second. Imagine an ancient, brutally shameful method of execution.
Right. A punishment designed by an iron-fisted empire. And not just to kill an individual, but to inflict, the maximum amount of physical agony.
Yeah, physical agony, psychological terror, public humiliation. I mean, it was a method so horrific that the Romans themselves, who were not exactly known for their delicate sensibilities, eventually considered it too barbaric to even speak of in polite society.
Absolutely. It was the ultimate deterrent, just a gruesome public billboard warning against rebellion, and it was reserved exclusively for the absolute lowest rungs of the social hierarchy. Slaves, pirates, enemies of the state.
Exactly. Now, I want you to imagine that exact method of torture, right? That bloody piece of rough-hewn wood becoming the single most ubiquitous, recognizable symbol in all of human history.
It really is wild when you think about it.
It is a symbol that appears on literally everything, from the crowns of Byzantine emperors, to high-fashion jewelry, to Superman comic books, to Japanese anime, and even like skateboard tricks.
Yeah.
How in the world did a machine designed for state-sponsored terror transform into an emblem of hope, rebellion, and pop culture?
Well, that transformation defies almost every conventional rule of how human culture adopts imagery.
Right.
Usually symbols are engineered, they are designed with a specific intent, then marketed and distributed. But this was a chaotic, organic evolution spanning 2 millennia.
And that brings us to today. Welcome to our deep dive. We are laying out a massive stack of sources for you today to really unpack this.
We really are.
At the foundation, we have this fascinating historical and linguistic journal article by Plumacea Turek. It unpacks the intricate textual evidence of the crucifixion.
Yeah, it's a brilliant piece of research.
And we are combining that with deep historical records on the life of the man who actually ordered the execution.
Pontius Pilate.
Exactly. And then we're tracking the evolution of this imagery in the arts over 2,000 years. So our mission today is to map an incredible collision of Roman bureaucracy, manuscript controversies, theological debates, and, well, artistic rebellion.
We're going to track this from the dusty, highly volatile province of first-century Judea all the way to the surrealist canvases of Salvador Dali.
And the neon-lit subcultures of the 20th century. I mean, if I had to use an analogy to set the baseline here for you listening, I'd compare this symbol to a piece of open-source software.
Oh, I like that.
Think about it. It started out with a highly specific, restricted usage, a brutal Roman tool to enforce compliance.
Right.
But over the centuries, that core code was downloaded, remixed, and reinterpreted by literally every culture on Earth. Some groups tried to scrub the code entirely from existence.
And others used it to build massive globe-spanning religious institutions.
Exactly, while others just hacked the code to make purely secular statements about political alienation or just artistic shock value.
The open-source framing works perfectly because the original program wasn't a myth. It was written in a very gritty, very real historical context.
It wasn't handed down from a mountaintop.
No, not at all. It was an administrative decision made by a middle management Roman official. So to understand how the symbol evolved, we really have to start by reconstructing the reality of the man who hit the execute command. Pontius Pilate.
Pontius Pilate. So he was the 5th governor of the Roman province of Judea, serving under the Emperor Tiberius from roughly 26 to 36 AD.
Right.
And for a very long time, Pilate existed in this strange historical twilight. We had textual records of him, but physical, archaeological proof of his administration was incredibly scarce.
It was so scarce that it actually led some early skeptics to wonder if he was merely a literary invention.
Right, like maybe he was just a character invented for the narrative. But that ambiguity vanished in 1961, didn't it?
Completely vanished. Archaeologists were excavating the ancient coastal city of Caesarea Maritima.
Which was basically the Roman headquarters, right?
Exactly. It was this magnificent Romanized city built by Herod the Great. It had a massive harbor, an amphitheater, a hippodrome. Yeah, it served as the administrative capital for the Romans in Judea. The governor wouldn't have lived in Jerusalem.
Too much tension there.
Oh, absolutely. Jerusalem was inland, culturally completely foreign to the Romans, and highly prone to religious unrest. The governor lived in Caesarea, enjoying the Mediterranean breeze and Roman amenities.
Sounds like a pretty good gig.
Right. He'd only travel to Jerusalem with heavily armed cohorts during major Jewish festivals, just to maintain crowd control.
Okay, so in the ruins of this Roman coastal stronghold, they uncover a piece of damaged limestone. The Pilate Stone,
Yes. And the archaeologists actually found it repurposed as a building block in a later theater.
which kind of shows how little reverence later generations had for it, right?
Totally. But the Latin inscription carved into the stone is unmistakable. It reads Tiberi Vemem on the first line, which is a dedication to the Emperor Tiberius.
Okay.
The second line clearly reads TVs Pella TVS, and the third line reads Pre-am ECTVS Evia EAE Fe.
Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Now, I want to drill down into that specific word, prefect. Because for centuries, later historians, even the great Roman historian Tacitus, referred to Pilate retroactively as a procurator.
Right. That was a common misconception.
But this stone proves his actual contemporary title was prefect.
Yeah.
Why does that distinction matter so much to our understanding of the man? Is it just, like, bureaucratic semantics?
Oh, no, it completely shifts our understanding of his primary function. A procurator was essentially a financial official.
Like an accountant.
Yeah, a glorified accountant responsible for managing the emperor's properties and collecting taxes. A prefectus, however, comes from military background.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a big difference.
Huge difference. Pilate was of the equestrian order, which is a middle rank of the Roman nobility. He wasn't some highborn senator sent to govern a peaceful province.
Right.
He was a military man, given command of auxiliary troops, and sent to manage a deeply rebellious, volatile frontier. His primary job wasn't balancing the books,
He was keeping the peace.
by any means necessary. He acted as the supreme judge and the chief of police.
And we also have physical evidence of his administration through the money he minted, right? The crude bronze pruta coins.
Yes. Pilate minted these small bronze coins between 29 and 32 AD, and when we look at these coins, we get a direct window into his governing philosophy.
Which was apparently very combative.
Extremely combative. Previous Roman governors in Judea had generally respected the strict Jewish commandment against graven images.
They kept things neutral.
Right, they minted coins with neutral agricultural symbols like palm trees or ears of barley. But Pilate deliberately broke that precedent. He minted coins featuring a literus.
Liduus. That's the curved wand used by Roman augurs, right? The pagan priests who interpreted the will of the gods by watching the flight of birds.
Exactly. He literally stamped pagan religious implements onto the currency that the local Jewish population had to use in their daily lives.
That just seems like an incredibly reckless move. I mean, putting a pagan symbol on a coin in first century Judea is deliberately provoking a population whose entire cultural identity is built around the strict rejection of idolatry.
It really is.
Was he actively trying to start an insurrection?
Well, it certainly points to a man who possessed a deep contempt for the local culture he was assigned to manage. And this brings us to the core dissonance we have to confront today.
Two different Pilates.
Yes, there is a massive psychological gap between the Pontius Pilate depicted in the Christian biblical narratives and the Pilate recorded by secular historical sources of his own era.
Yeah, let's unpack that. In the Gospels, Pilate is famously depicted as this hesitant, almost fragile bureaucrat.
Right.
He interviews Jesus, repeatedly announces he finds no fault in the man, desperately tries to find a loophole to release him.
And ultimately physically washes his hands in front of an angry mob.
Exactly. Declaring himself innocent of the blood he is about to shed. He basically caves to the pressure of the local religious leaders.
But when we cross-reference that with contemporary writers, specifically the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria and the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, that hesitant judge completely evaporates.
Completely.
The historical record reveals a ruthless, iron-fisted authoritarian who repeatedly and seemingly intentionally antagonized his subjects.
And used extreme violence to crush the slightest hint of dissent. Let's examine the specific incidents the sources outline, because they paint a picture of a man who did not care at all about local public opinion.
Right. Well, the first major crisis of his tenure involved the imperial standards. Josephus records that shortly after taking office, Pilate ordered his troops to march into Jerusalem carrying military standards bearing the effigy of the Emperor Tiberius.
Again, a direct violation of the commandment against graven images and brought directly into the holy city.
And Josephus notes a critical detail here. Pilate ordered the troops to move in under the cover of darkness.
So he knew.
Oh, he knew exactly how explosive this action was. When the city awoke to find pagan idols in the shadow of the temple, the reaction was absolute outrage.
I can imagine.
A massive crowd of Jewish citizens left Jerusalem, marched the 60-odd miles to Caesarea, and surrounded Pilate's coastal residence. They protested for 5 days and 5 nights.
And I'm assuming the military prefect didn't invite them in for a diplomatic negotiation?
Definitely not. On the sixth day, Pilate summoned the protesters to the local arena. He had secretly ordered his soldiers to surround the seating area.
Oh, wow.
When the crowd renewed their demands, Pilate gave a signal. The soldiers drew their swords, threatening to massacre the entire crowd on the spot if they didn't accept the images of Caesar.
A brutal intimidation tactic.
But the intimidation failed. In this astonishing display of civil disobedience, the protesters threw themselves onto the ground en masse, bared their necks, and declared they would gladly die before seeing their ancient laws violated.
That must have been an incredible sight.
Pilate was completely caught off guard. He was ruthless, but he wasn't an idiot. Massacring thousands of unarmed citizens over a political stunt would have triggered a full-scale province-wide rebellion.
Which would have looked terrible on his resume.
Exactly. It would likely have ended with his own execution by the emperor for incompetence. So he backed down and ordered the standards removed.
You would think a close call like that would teach a governor to tread lightly, you know?
It didn't. Philo records a similar incident involving golden shields. Pilate decided to hang golden shields dedicated to Tiberius on the walls of Herod's palace right in Jerusalem.
Poking the bear again.
The local leadership, including the sons of Herod, petitioned him to take them down. Pilate stubbornly refused to yield an inch. So the Jewish leaders escalated the matter by writing a direct letter to Emperor Tiberius in Rome.
Bypassing the middle management.
Exactly. And Tiberius was reportedly furious. He wrote a scathing reprimand to Pilate, ordering the shields transferred out of Jerusalem to a temple in Caesarea.
Ouch.
Philo explicitly claims that Pilate panicked when the petition was sent. He was terrified that a direct inquiry from Rome would expose the massive corruption, the executions without trial, and the endless cruelty of his administration.
But the most visceral example of his cruelty is the aqueduct incident, isn't it?
Yes. Josephus provides the details. Pilate initiated a major infrastructure project, building a new aqueduct to bring fresh water into Jerusalem.
Which on paper sounds like a vital civic improvement.
On paper, yes. The problem was how he funded it. He confiscated money from the korbanos, the sacred treasury of the temple.
He seized holy money, dedicated to the divine, to build Roman plumbing. That's wild.
It was a massive insult. When Pilate visited Jerusalem, tens of thousands of people formed a mob, surrounding his tribunal and hurling insults at him.
Let me guess, he didn't back down this time.
No. This time, Pilate didn't bother with the theatrical threat of swords in an arena. He had his soldiers dress in plain clothes, hiding heavy clubs under their garments, and ordered them to infiltrate the crowd.
Wow, an ancient deployment of secret police.
Exactly. On Pilate's signal, the soldiers didn't just arrest the ringleaders, they began indiscriminately bludgeoning the protesters.
That's horrifying.
The sheer chaos of armed men striking from within a densely packed crowd triggered a massive stampede. Many were beaten to death and countless others were trampled by their own people trying to escape. The rebellion was drowned in blood.
So here is the massive contradiction we have to resolve for you all listening. If Pilate was a man who happily dispatched secret police to bludgeon unarmed protesters to death over municipal funding, why would he nervously ask a crowd what to do with a single Galilean street preacher?
Right.
Why does the biblical narrative show him desperately trying to avoid executing Jesus when his entire historical resume is built on executing people who cause trouble?
It's the big question. Historians and biblical scholars propose a few compelling frameworks to resolve this tension. The first is a purely geopolitical theory involving the power structures back in Rome.
Okay.
Some historians, like E. Stauffer, emphasize the role of Lucius Aelius Sejanus.
Sejanus. He was the Praetorian prefect, right? Essentially the most powerful man in Rome, while Emperor Tiberius was living in self-imposed exile on the island of Capri.
Exactly. Sejanus was practically running the empire, and he was famously hostile toward the Jewish population. Many scholars believe Pilate was appointed by Sejanus, or at least heavily aligned with his anti-Jewish policies.
I see where this is going.
As long as Sejanus was in power, Pilate could be as brutal as he wanted in Judea, knowing his patron in Rome would protect him.
But the political winds in Rome shifted violently, didn't they?
They did. In 31 AD, Tiberius discovered that Sejanus was plotting a coup. Sejanus was executed for treason, and Tiberius unleashed a paranoid, bloody purge across the empire.
Eliminating anyone connected to his former right-hand man.
Yes. So if Pilate owed his position to Sejanus, he would suddenly find himself incredibly vulnerable.
Because his protector was dead and the emperor was hunting down allies.
Exactly. If the trial of Jesus occurred around 33 AD, as some chronologies suggest, Pilate was operating in a state of sheer political terror. He had just survived a massive imperial purge. He knew the Jewish leadership had successfully petitioned Tiberius before, during the incident with the golden shields. If the high priests accused Pilate of harboring a rebel who claimed to be the king of the Jews, and Pilate dismissed the charges.
They could easily write another letter to Tiberius accusing Pilate of treason.
Exactly. The hesitation we see in the Gospels might not be moral weakness at all. It might be the calculated panic of a bureaucrat trying to survive a political minefield without triggering a riot that would end his career and his life.
That makes a ton of sense. But there's another interpretation, though, isn't there? One that suggests the biblical Pilate isn't weak at all, but rather highly manipulative.
Yes. Scholars like Warren Carter argue that we misread the gospel narratives entirely. Pilate isn't caving to the crowd, he is using them.
How so?
He is navigating an incredibly volatile city overflowing with religious pilgrims during the Passover festival. If he simply arrests and executes a popular figure, he risks an immediate uprising.
Right, he doesn't want another riot.
But by forcing the local elite and the crowd to publicly demand the execution, Pilate achieves his goal, eliminating a potential threat, while completely absolving himself of the political fallout.
The hand-washing is just theater.
Exactly. It's a PR move.
That's fascinating. Ultimately, though, Pilate's brutal instincts sealed his fate anyway, didn't they?
They did. Josephus reports that his final act as governor involved a group of Samaritans who had gathered at their holy site, Mount Gerizim. They believed a prophet would reveal sacred artifacts buried by Moses.
And Pilate saw that as a threat.
Pilate viewed any large gathering as a preliminary rebellion. He sent heavily armed cavalry to intercept them, resulting in a horrific slaughter of unarmed pilgrims.
But the Samaritans didn't just take it, though. They went over his head.
They appealed to Lucius Vitellius, the Roman legate of Syria, who was Pilate's direct superior. Vitellius had seen enough. He relieved Pilate of his command and ordered him to travel to Rome to answer for his crimes before the emperor.
But Tiberius died in March of 37 AD, right as Pilate was making the journey back to Italy.
He did, and Pilate vanishes from the historical record at that exact moment.
Wow, just gone.
We don't know if he was exiled, executed by the new Emperor Caligula, or simply retired to an obscure estate, but his historical footprint is undeniable. We have his stones, his coins, and the detailed records of his administrative terror.
And establishing his unquestionable historical reality forces us to look at the paper trail he left behind regarding the crucifixion itself. So we are moving from the man to the manuscripts now.
Right.
When you're looking back 2,000 years, finding concrete evidence of a single execution of a non-citizen is incredibly difficult. Let's look at the actual documents that prove this event happened.
Historians divide the documentary evidence into Christian and non-Christian sources. Let's examine the Christian sources first, focusing on the letters of the Apostle Paul as detailed in Przemysł Turek's research.
Okay, so we are talking about epistles like 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. What makes these letters so critical from a purely historical, non-theological perspective?
The timeline. The undisputed letters of Paul were written between 51 and 58 CE. The crucifixion itself is generally dated by historians to somewhere between 29 and 33 CE.
Wow, okay. That puts the earliest written accounts less than 20 years after the execution.
Exactly.
In historical terms, that is an eye blink. It's the equivalent of us today discussing events that happened in 2005 or 2006.
It really is. Paul isn't compiling folklore that has drifted through centuries of oral tradition. He is writing about an event while thousands of eyewitnesses, including the executioners and the victims' families, are still alive and walking around the Mediterranean.
That's a great point. You can't just make up a public execution 20 years later.
Furthermore, in these letters, Paul does not present the crucifixion as a symbolic myth or a spiritual metaphor. He treats it as the foundational, undeniable historical fact of his movement.
Right.
In 1 Corinthians, he admits that proclaiming Christ crucified is a massive stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. In Galatians, he reminds his audience that Jesus was publicly exhibited as crucified.
Right, like you do not anchor a brand new, highly controversial religious movement on a public execution if that execution didn't actually happen. Your opponents could effortlessly debunk you.
Exactly.
That makes logical sense, but a skeptic will rightly point out that Paul is a highly biased source. He is trying to build a church, right? What about the people who hated this new movement? Do we have Roman records?
We do, and the Roman historical consensus is airtight. Let's look at Publius Cornelius Tacitus, considered one of the greatest historians of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Around 116 CE, he wrote his masterpiece, the Annals. Tacitus is recounting the reign of Emperor Nero, specifically the devastating Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Nero needed a scapegoat for the fire, and he chose a new, despised sect called the Christians.
Now, Tacitus despised the Christians himself. He wasn't a sympathizer.
Not at all. He calls their beliefs a deadly superstition. But in explaining who they are, he provides a crucial, objective historical data point.
What does he say?
He writes, Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate.
Wow. A Roman historian with access to imperial archives confirming the name, the specific emperor, the specific governor, and the specific punishment.
Exactly. Then we have Lucian of Samosata, writing around 165 CE. Lucian was a Greek satirist. He wrote a work called The Passing of Peregrinus, where he openly mocks the early Christians for their gullibility.
A stand-up routine, basically.
Yeah. He refers to Jesus as the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. He derisively calls him that crucified sophist.
So even the satirists writing comedy routines about how foolish Christians were never denied the central historical fact that their founder was executed on a cross.
Right. We also have a deeply poignant letter from Marabar Serapion, a Stoic philosopher. Sometime after 73 CE, he was imprisoned by the Romans. From his cell, he wrote a letter to his son, reflecting on the folly of persecuting great thinkers. He asks what the Athenians gained by executing Socrates, what the people of Samos gained by burning Pythagoras, and what the Jews gained by killing their wise king.
The wise king being an unmistakable reference to the events of the Gospels.
Yes. The execution is treated as common, accepted knowledge across the intellectual landscape of the ancient Mediterranean.
But if we want to talk about non-Christian sources, we have to tackle the most controversial manuscript in ancient history, right? The Testimonium Flavianum.
Oh, absolutely.
This is where historical research turns into a forensic detective story. So the Testimonium Flavianum is a paragraph found within a massive 20-volume history called Antiquities of the Jews. It was written in the late 1st century by Flavius Josephus.
Josephus is an incredibly complex figure. Born Yosef ben Mattatiyahu in Jerusalem just a few years after the crucifixion, he actually fought against the Romans in the Jewish War, was captured, switched sides, and became a historian sponsored by the Roman Flavian emperors.
A survivor.
Truly. No one knew the political and cultural landscape of first-century Judea better than him.
And in Book 18 of this massive history, there is a paragraph that discusses Jesus. But for centuries, scholars have looked at the standard Greek version of this text and immediately flagged it as highly suspicious. Why?
Because the standard Greek manuscript, which was preserved and copied throughout Western Europe, reads like a glowing Christian confession of faith.
Really?
Yeah. It describes Jesus as a wise man, quote, if it be lawful to call him a man. It claims he performed wonderful works, and then it explicitly states he was the Christ, and asserts that he appeared to his followers alive on the 3rd day.
If I can interject here, reading that Greek text is exactly like looking at a Wikipedia page about a highly controversial historical figure and instantly realizing that a superfan has hacked the page and rewritten the entry.
That is a perfect analogy.
It just sounds absurdly out of character.
Yeah.
Josephus was an Orthodox Jew who worked for the Roman emperor. He never converted to Christianity. Why on earth would he write he was the Christ and confirm the resurrection? If he believed that, he would have joined the church.
Exactly. Your Wikipedia analogy is perfectly aligned with how modern historians view the transmission of ancient texts. Medieval Christian monks were essentially the sole administrators of the Wikipedia of the Middle Ages.
Right. They controlled the servers.
They possessed a monopoly on literacy and the physical copying of manuscripts. For a long time, skeptical scholars looked at the Testimonium Flavianum and declared the entire paragraph a complete forgery, inserted out of thin air by a monk who wanted to force Josephus to validate the Bible.
But the scholarly consensus shifted, didn't it? They realized it wasn't a total fabrication, but rather a text that had been tampered with. How do you prove that? How do you undo a theological fan edit that happened over 1,000 years ago?
You have to look outside the Western European echo chamber. You have to find manuscripts that escaped the editorial control of the Western monks. And linguists found exactly that in the Middle East, preserved in Arabic and Syriac translations.
This involves two distinct historical figures, right? Agapius and Michael the Syrian.
Yes. In the 10th century, a Christian historian writing in Arabic, Agapius of Manbi, compiled a universal history. He quoted the famous paragraph from Josephus. But his Arabic text lacked the glaring theological endorsements.
What did it say instead?
It didn't say he was the Christ. It said perhaps he was the Christ.
Wow. That single word, perhaps, completely alters the entire orientation of the paragraph. It shifts from a confession of faith to an objective report on what other people believed.
It does, but the evidence gets even stronger. In the 12th century, Michael the Syrian, a patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church, compiled a chronicle using a much older Syriac translation of Josephus.
Okay.
When we look at his version, the text reads, "He was supposed to be the Christ," or in some translations, "He was believed to be the Christ."
So by triangulating the Greek, the Arabic, and the Syriac manuscripts, historians can essentially strip away the medieval Christian edits and reconstruct what Josephus actually wrote in the 1st century.
Yes. The reconstructed, authentic text essentially reads, "Around this time lived Jesus, a wise man who performed surprising deeds. He won over many Jews and Greeks. He was believed to be the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. And the tribe of the Christians is not extinct to this day."
That is objective, secular journalism. It validates the historical reality of the crucifixion without validating the religious claims surrounding it. When you stack Paul, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar Serapion, and the reconstructed Josephus together, the historical reality is unavoidable.
The execution happened.
But that historical reality creates a profound problem. What happens when a gritty, undeniable historical fact directly conflicts with the foundational theology of a major religious movement?
Right, how do you reconcile a savior dying in agony with the concept of ultimate divine power?
Exactly. That tension forces theology to creatively rewrite history. We have to look at the groups who scared at the historical reality of the cross and simply said, no, that is an illusion. It never happened.
And the most prominent global example of this denial is found within Islam.
Right, and I want to be incredibly precise here for you listening. We are impartially reporting the theological claims found in the historical sources. In Islam, Jesus, known as Isa, is a highly revered vital prophet. But the idea that he ended his life nailed to a piece of Roman wood is explicitly rejected.
The doctrine is crystallized in the Quran, specifically in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verses 157 and 158. That text addresses the claims of those who boasted that they had killed Christ Jesus, the messenger of Allah.
What does it say?
The Quran unequivocally states, "But they killed him not, nor crucified him. Only a likeness of that was shown to them."
Only a likeness of that was shown to them. That implies a divine substitution or an illusion. The text goes on to say that God raised Jesus up to himself, completely bypassing the torture and death. The executioners thought they won, but they were tricked. Did this concept originate in the 7th century with the Quran, or does it have an older theological footprint?
The intellectual lineage of this denial actually traces back hundreds of years earlier, deep into the 2nd century CE, originating within early Christian Gnostic sects.
The Gnostics, they're fascinating. They were essentially the mystical rebels of early Christianity, heavily influenced by Greek Platonic philosophy.
Yes, a foundational premise of Gnostic thought is the strict separation of the spiritual and the material. They believed the material world, flesh, bone, dirt, blood, physical pain was inherently flawed, chaotic, and often evil, created by a lesser ignorant deity known as a demiurge.
Right. The true supreme God existed in a state of pure, untainted, immaterial spirit. But if you are building a theology on the absolute rejection of physical matter, you have a catastrophic problem when the canonical Gospels tell you that your divine Savior was beaten to a pulp, bled out, and died in agonizing physical pain. It shatters the entire philosophical framework.
To solve this philosophical crisis, Gnostic thinkers developed a concept known as Docetism. The term derives from the Greek verb doke, which translates to seem or to appear.
So they argued that Christ only appeared to have a physical body.
Precisely. They claimed Christ was a purely divine phantom. He was a projection of light. He didn't left footprints in the sand, he didn't cast a shadow, he didn't need to eat. And crucially, a pure spirit cannot be nailed to a piece of wood and killed.
Right.
The crucifixion, in the docetic view, was a grand illusion staged for the benefit of those trapped in the material world.
The specifics of how this illusion played out get incredibly cinematic, don't they? Look at the teachings of Basilides in the early 2nd century.
Oh, Basilides proposed a radical narrative substitution. According to the Gospel of Mark, a bystander named Simon of Cyrene was pulled from the crowd and forced to carry the crossbeam for Jesus when he collapsed.
Right, that's in the standard text.
But Basilides claimed that on the way to Golgotha, a miraculous transfiguration occurred. Jesus swapped physical appearances with Simon of Cyrene.
A divine bait and switch.
According to this Gnostic tradition, Simon of Cyrene was crucified in ignorance and error, possessing the physical appearance of Jesus. Meanwhile, the true divine Jesus took on the appearance of Simon, stood in the crowd, and literally laughed at the executioners and the Roman authorities before ascending flawlessly into the spiritual realm.
I cannot help but compare this to the plot mechanics of a modern superhero franchise. It's the classic hologram fake-out.
It really is.
You know, the hero is cornered, the villain activates the doomsday weapon, the hero is vaporized. But wait. The camera pans back, and we realize it was just a hard light projection, or a shape-shifting body double. The real hero is standing safely on a rooftop 3 blocks away, smirking at the villain's stupidity.
That is a remarkably accurate modern parallel. Both the Gnostics and the writers of superhero films are trying to solve the exact same narrative problem. How do you depict an all-powerful being facing defeat without actually diminishing their power?
Right. It's a narrative device used to ensure that the hero's ultimate power is never truly compromised. So what is the underlying logic that connects the 2nd century Gnostics to the later Islamic perspective?
As the Encyclopedia of Islam details regarding the Quranic perspective, the foundational concept is Sunnat Allah, which translates to God's practice or God's custom. In this theological framework, God is entirely sovereign and he'll invariably defend his true prophets. Faith must triumph over the forces of darkness.
If Jesus, a beloved and sinless prophet of God, were to be successfully tortured and killed by corrupt local politicians and pagan Roman soldiers, it would represent a catastrophic defeat for the divine. It would mean the evil forces possessed more power than God's chosen messenger.
In that theological ecosystem, such a defeat is categorically impossible. God would never permit his prophet to suffer such absolute shameful degradation. Therefore, God must have intervened, confounded the plots of the Romans, saved Jesus, and left the executioners grasping at a phantom.
Denying the cross isn't a demotion of Jesus. It's the ultimate defense of his divine honor.
Exactly.
While the Gnostics in Islam erased the physical reality of the crucifixion to preserve that glory, the mainstream Orthodox Christian Church took the exact opposite approach. They doubled down on the grit.
They really did.
They anchored their entire theology on the premise that the execution did happen, that the physical flesh mattered, and that the suffering itself was the mechanism of cosmic salvation.
However, acknowledging the theology of the cross is very different from visually depicting it. And this brings us to an astonishing reality of art history. For the first 3 centuries of the Christian movement, the cross was virtually invisible in their art.
Which is wild. If you walk into a Christian church today, the crucifix is the absolute focal point. It's on the altar, it's in the stained glass. The idea that early Christians refused to paint it seems almost counterintuitive.
Yeah.
By the visual silence.
Because they lived in the Roman Empire. As the renowned scholar Martin Hengel pointed out in his research, crucifixion wasn't a symbolic concept for early Christians. It was an active, terrifying reality. They saw it on the roadsides. They smelled the decaying bodies.
Oh, wow.
It was an obscene, traumatizing instrument of state terror. The psychological barrier to taking that horrifying reality and turning it into an object of visual reverence was simply too high. It was considered an unfit, almost shameful subject for artistic portrayal.
In fact, the very first visual depiction we possess of the crucifixion isn't a beautiful fresco in a catacomb. It's an insult. It's graffiti scratched into a wall by someone mocking the religion.
Yes, the Alexamenos graffito. It was discovered etched into the plaster of a building near the Palatine Hill in Rome, dating to the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE. It is a crude caricature depicting a human figure with the head of a donkey nailed to a cross. To the left stands a young man raising his hand in a gesture of worship.
And underneath it, in sloppy Greek letters, it reads, Alexamenos worships his god.
It is the ancient equivalent of a cruel schoolyard taunt. It perfectly encapsulates how the pagan Roman world viewed the Christian narrative. To the Romans, worshipping a deity who was successfully executed as a state criminal was the height of absurdity.
It meant you were following a weak, defeated loser. The donkey head emphasizes the supposed stupidity of the belief.
Exactly.
How does an image go from a donkey-headed incel scratched into plaster to the jeweled centerpieces of European cathedrals? What was the catalyst for that massive visual shift?
The catalyst was imperial politics. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. More importantly, he officially banned crucifixion as a method of execution across the empire out of respect for Jesus.
That is the critical variable right there. Once the Roman state stops using the punishment, the visual trauma begins to fade from the public consciousness. People are no longer seeing actual corpses on crosses outside their city walls. The instrument of torture can transition into an abstract symbol.
Furthermore, Constantine's mother, Empress Helena, purportedly traveled to Jerusalem and discovered the true cross buried at Golgotha. This act transformed the cross from a taboo instrument of death into the most sought-after holy relic in the world.
So they start painting it.
Yes, artists began depicting the crux gemata, a cross entirely covered in precious jewels, representing victory over death.
But even when they finally began painting the figure of Jesus on the cross, they completely sanitized the reality of the execution, right? They refused to show the pain.
Let's look at how the Eastern Byzantine tradition handled the imagery. A prime example is found in the Rabula Gospels, an illuminated manuscript created in a Syrian monastery in 586 CE. In this depiction, Christ is on the cross, but he looks nothing like a dying man.
Describe the imagery for us.
He is fully awake. His eyes are wide open, staring straight ahead at the viewer. His posture is rigid and strong. He is entirely invulnerable to the physical reality of the nails. Furthermore, he is not depicted wearing the humiliating loincloth of a Roman prisoner. He's wearing a long, regal, purple tunic known as a colobium.
The theology dictates the art. The Eastern Church emphasized the divine, unconquerable nature of Christ. He isn't suffering on the cross, he is ruling from it. He's a king sitting on a wooden throne. When does the art finally pivot? When do we start seeing the visceral agony, the twisted limbs, the crown of thorns that we associate with the imagery today?
That pivot occurs in the West several centuries later. It is driven by a massive cultural and theological shift toward what we call German mysticism, which prioritized emotional connection and empathy with human suffering. A pivotal artifact that marks this transition is the Giro cross.
Carved in Cologne, Germany in the late 10th century.
Yes, it is a near life-size sculpture carved from oak. And the contrast with the Byzantine Rabula Gospels is shocking. The Giro cross introduces the concept of the dead or dying Christ.
So he's not awake staring at you anymore?
Not at all. His eyes are closed. His head slumps heavily onto his chest. His body is no longer rigid. It sags under the immense pull of gravity, twisting into an S shape, emphasizing the agonizing tension on the nails in his hands and feet.
Wow.
The muscles are strained. The belly bulges outward as he asphyxiates.
As the art historian Gertrude Schiller noted, it represents suffering and its extreme physical consequences. The artist wants you to feel the weight of the dying body.
As we move into the Gothic period and the late Middle Ages in Western Europe, this focus on brutal realism escalates. The goal of the art was to evoke overwhelming pity and devotion. Artists introduced the crown of thorns, extreme lacerations, and angels hovering around the cross holding chalices to catch the visceral streams of blood spurting from his wounds.
They also integrated bizarre allegorical elements from medieval folklore to explain the theology of the sacrifice. I'm fascinated by the symbol of the pelican.
The pelican in her piety. This is fascinating. In medieval European bestiaries, there was a widespread legend about the mother pelican. It was believed that in times of extreme famine, if a mother pelican could not find food for her chicks, she would take her beak and violently pierce her own breast, feeding her starving offspring with her own blood to keep them alive, sacrificing herself in the process.
So medieval artists started carving and painting pelicans at the top of crucifixes.
Exactly.
It's a direct biological metaphor for the theological concept of the Eucharist Christ, shedding his blood to grant eternal life to humanity.
You can trace the entire evolution of Christian theology, from the early trauma to the triumphant kingship to the deeply emotional mysticism, simply by tracking the amount of physical pain artists were willing to carve into the wood.
The evolution of the visual art is astonishing, but the mythology surrounding the people involved in the event mutated just as drastically. We have to talk about what happened to the reputation of the man who started it all. The Roman bureaucrat from the beginning of our exploration was about to receive the most bizarre post-mortem makeover in history.
Because Pilate was the structural linchpin of the trial, he became an obsession for early Christian writers. They generated a massive body of apocryphal literature texts that were widely read but ultimately excluded from the canonical Bible, known collectively as the Pilate cycle.
Okay.
What is truly fascinating is how his legacy fractured into two diametrically opposed extremes, cleanly divided by geography.
Let's start with the Eastern traditions, because this is where the narrative takes a turn that honestly defies modern logic. In the East, Pilate is given a massive promotion.
In the Coptic and Ethiopian traditions, Pontius Pilate and his wife are venerated as holy saints.
Hold on. Stop right there. I need to push back on this heavily. You are telling me that the man who issued the legal decree, who commanded the soldiers to physically nail their deity to a cross, is venerated by those same believers as a saint?
I am.
That makes absolutely zero logical sense. How does the early Coptic Church justify that massive cognitive dissonance?
It requires an intense amplification of the hesitation we see in the biblical Gospels. The Eastern apocryphal texts, such as the Acts of Pilate, lean completely into the idea that Pilate was a helpless pawn in a cosmic drama. The blame is shifted entirely off his shoulders onto the local crowds. In these texts, Pilate is portrayed as a secret believer who recognizes Jesus' divinity but is politically trapped.
The lore gets incredibly specific in the Ethiopian tradition, doesn't it?
Yes, specifically in a late antique text called the Book of the Cock, which is still read in the Ethiopian church during Holy Week. The text introduces a sprawling narrative where Jesus interacts heavily with Pilate's family. In one scene, Jesus miraculously cures Pilate's daughters, who had been born deaf and mute.
So he becomes indebted to the man he is supposed to judge.
Exactly. As a result of these miracles, Pilate and his entire household secretly convert to the faith. The lore continues past the crucifixion. Apocryphal letters claim Pilate wrote directly to Emperor Tiberius, defending Jesus and attacking the Jewish leadership.
Wow.
Some traditions even claim that Tiberius, furious that Pilate allowed the execution of a divine being, ordered Pilate to be beheaded. Pilate accepts his execution willingly as a baptism of blood, dying as a Christian martyr with a voice from heaven calling him blessed.
They took the brutal, club-wielding enforcer we read about in Josephus and retroactively turned him into a tragic, holy martyr. The psychological need to absolve the Roman authority in the East is staggering. But while the East was canonizing him, the West was transforming him into a literal monster.
In Western Europe, the legends surrounding Pilate took on a dark, almost gothic horror tone. This is encapsulated in texts like the Mors Pilati or the Death of Pilate.
According to this Western legend, Pilate doesn't die a holy martyr. Tiberius summons him to Rome to answer for his crimes, but Pilate, paralyzed by guilt and terror, commits suicide using his own dagger. But the story doesn't end with his death. The earth itself rejects his body.
The legend states that the Romans tied a heavy stone to his cursed corpse and threw it into the Tiber River in Rome. But the presence of his body triggered violent demonic storms flooding the city. Terrified, the Romans dragged the body out of the water and transported it to France, throwing it into the Rhone River near Vienne.
But the Rhone rejects him too. The demonic storms return.
So they drag his rotting corpse further north, high into the remote Alps in modern-day Switzerland. They dump the body into an isolated, freezing alpine lake nestled against a jagged mountain.
A mountain that is still known today as Mount Pilatus, overlooking Lake Lucerne.
Exactly. For centuries, local Swiss folklore maintained that severe thunderstorms in the Alps were caused by the restless, cursed spirit of Pontius Pilate thrashing in the waters of that dark lake.
He literally becomes a boogeyman embedded in the European landscape. And this villainous caricature carries directly over into the theater of the Middle Ages. The medieval passion plays were massive, multi-day community events, and Pilate was the star role.
Oh, absolutely.
But the way he was played depended heavily on the local politics of the town putting on the play.
In England, the portrayal of Pilate was deeply satirical. The actors playing him would strut around the stage dressed in elaborate, ostentatious clothing, and they would frequently speak their lines in French or Latin, while the rest of the cast spoke in common English.
Why use French and Latin?
Because in medieval England, following the Norman conquest, French and Latin were the languages of the ruling aristocracy, the royal courts, and the often corrupt legal system. By having Pilate speak like a pompous Norman lord, the commoners in the audience could safely mock and hiss at their own oppressive local elites under the safe guise of participating in a biblical play.
Clever. Pilate became a stand-in for the corrupt local judge who taxed them into poverty.
But on the continent, in Germany and France, the theatrical portrayal of Pilate took a much darker, much more dangerous turn.
They did. And as a reminder to you listening, we are reporting on these historical texts with absolute neutrality, simply analyzing the mechanics of how the narratives were constructed.
In many continental passion plays, Pilate was portrayed sympathetically as a fundamentally decent magistrate who was aggressively bullied into ordering the execution.
Which, again, shifts the blame.
It shifted the blame entirely away from the Roman Empire and placed the guilt squarely and exclusively on the local Jewish populations. Some theatrical productions even went so far as to dress the Roman Pilate in stereotypically Jewish clothing, visually blurring the lines to associate all the villains of the play together in the minds of the uneducated peasant audience. It was a catastrophic use of theater that actively fueled historical prejudices and violence.
Let's analyze the root cause of this narrative distortion. Why did the early Christians, the writers who first generated these apocryphal texts that later influenced these plays, need to exonerate Pilate so badly? Why did they systematically rewrite history to make the Roman governor look innocent and shift the blame entirely to the local population?
It was a strategy of sheer political survival. You have to remember the context of the first 3 centuries of the Christian movement. They were an illegal minority sect living under the absolute totalitarian control of the Roman Empire. They were periodically subjected to horrific state-sponsored persecutions, thrown to beasts in the arena, burned alive.
If your foundational religious documents explicitly declare the Roman government is a corrupt, evil institution that unjustly murdered our divine savior, you are essentially begging the emperor to exterminate you. It is political suicide.
Exactly. It was highly politically expedient for early Christians to formulate a narrative that flattered Roman authority. They needed texts that essentially argued, oh, the Romans are just. The Roman governor realized Jesus was innocent and tried desperately to save him. The Roman Empire bears no hostility toward us. It was those other local factions who caused the problem.
Shifting the blame to a marginalized group was a survival tactic for the early church. But that tactic eventually solidified into lasting tragic prejudices that poisoned European history for centuries. It is a profoundly dark example of how the narrative of the cross can be engineered for political ends.
But this incredible elasticity, this ability to project whatever a culture needs onto the imagery of the crucifixion, did not stop in the Middle Ages. The symbol continued to mutate, eventually breaking free from the boundaries of religion entirely.
Which brings us to the final phase of our exploration. We are moving into the 20th and 21st centuries. In the modern era, crucifixion imagery ceased to be strictly Christian iconography. It became a global, secular shorthand.
It is now utilized by artists, writers, and musicians around the world to instantly communicate themes of ultimate suffering, protest, societal alienation, and noble sacrifice, completely detached from the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth.
Modern art recognized the explosive power of the symbol immediately. Let's look at the surrealist master, Salvador Dali.
In 1954, Dali painted his masterpiece, Crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus. He doesn't paint Jesus hanging on a rough-hewn wooden cross from the 1st century. He places the figure on a magnificent, floating, 4-dimensional mathematical structure known as a hypercube or a tesseract.
The visual is stunning. He merges classical, meticulous Renaissance painting techniques with the mind-bending concepts of quantum physics and advanced mathematics.
Dali is attempting to represent the cross not as a historical piece of wood, but as a cosmic event that transcends visible 3-dimensional space. The geometry of the hypercube implies that the sacrifice exists in dimensions we cannot perceive.
Dali used it to explore physics and mysticism. But then you have the shock artists. The artists who utilize the cross specifically because it is so heavily loaded with cultural and religious weight. They wanted to weaponize that reverence to force a reaction.
A prime example of this weaponization is the performance artist Chris Burden. In 1974, he staged a piece called Transfixed in Venice, California. He stood on the rear bumper of a Volkswagen Beetle, leaned back over the roof, and had his assistants literally physically drive metal nails through the palms of his hands into the body of the car.
My God.
The garage door was opened, the engine was read for exactly 2 minutes, the engine was cut, and he was pulled back inside.
Having yourself physically nailed to a Volkswagen Bug, it's almost unfathomable. What is he trying to communicate by mimicking the crucifixion on a mass-produced consumer vehicle?
He is juxtaposing the ultimate symbol of spiritual suffering with the ultimate symbol of mundane mid-century American consumerism and car culture. It forces the viewer to confront the visceral reality of pain in a sterilized modern world.
Or consider the painter Robert Cianedella. In 1997, he unveiled a painting depicting a massive red-suited Santa Claus nailed to a cross. It was displayed in the window of the Art Students League in New York City right before the holidays.
The public outcry was instantaneous and massive.
But the point of the painting was a protest against the extreme, grotesque commercialization of Christmas. He used the sacred, solemn symbol of the holiday to violently critique what the holiday had mutated into, a festival of consumption.
But the secularization of the symbol isn't restricted to high art or controversial galleries. It has completely saturated mainstream pop culture. Comic books, for instance, rely heavily on this imagery.
If you open a comic book, you will frequently see a hero struck down, floating in the void or falling from the sky in a cruciform pose. Arms outstretched, head slumped. It is a visual shortcut the artist uses to signal to the reader. This character is making a messianic sacrifice to save the world. Superman is the most frequent recipient of this imagery.
But one of the most brilliant literary uses of the symbol occurred in the late 1980s in an issue of the comic book Animal Man written by Grant Morrison titled The Coyote Gospel.
This is a masterpiece of metafiction. Morrison creates a character named Crafty, who is essentially a thinly veiled stand-in for Wile E. Coyote from the classic Looney Tunes cartoons. In the comic, Crafty makes a deal with his creator to end the endless violence of his cartoon universe. But the price is that he must be exiled to our real world, where he suffers endless, horrific physical agony, being crushed, blown up, and hit by trucks, dying over and over again, only to resurrect to maintain the peace.
And at the climax of the issue, this cartoon coyote is shot and depicted lying dead in a perfect cruciform pose.
It was nominated for an Eisner Award because it brilliantly hijacked the solemn imagery of the crucifixion to force the reader to ask a disturbing question. Why do we require fictional characters to suffer endless violence for our own entertainment? We demand sacrifices for our amusement.
The symbol has also crossed international borders, heavily permeating Japanese anime and manga. What makes this fascinating is how the symbol is utilized when it is completely stripped of its Western religious context. In Japan, Christians make up a tiny fraction of the population. The cross does not carry the innate sacred weight it does in the West.
Which means anime directors can use the imagery purely for its aesthetic power. Look at a monumental series like Neon Genesis Evangelion. The show is overflowing with crosses. When the massive alien beings known as angels are destroyed, they detonate in colossal cross-shaped columns of light that reach into the stratosphere. Characters are literally crucified in surreal mindscapes.
Western audiences watched Evangelion and spend years trying to decode the deep Christian theological messaging. But the co-creator, Kazuya Tsurumaki, explicitly stated in interviews that there was no Christian meaning intended. They chose the cross simply because it looked mysterious and visually imposing.
It communicates danger, awe, and apocalyptic dread without carrying any theological baggage.
Cultural scholars like Michael Broderick argue that for Japanese audiences, the towering, cross-shaped explosions in anime are more closely associated with the apocalyptic trauma of the atomic mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki than they are with the death of a first-century carpenter. It is a symbol of ultimate, overwhelming destruction.
The detachment from religion is so complete that in other manga series like Full Metal Alchemist, crucifixion is used simply as a brutal symbol of harsh state justice. The irony is that when these mangas were translated and brought to the United States, Western distributors actually had to censor or alter the crucifixion images.
The irony is profound. A secular Japanese artist uses the cross as a generic symbol of torture, but the Western publishers have to erase it because the symbol remains too sacred and culturally volatile in their own society to be used casually in a comic book.
And the subcultures just keep hacking the code. You see it in music and sports.
Yeah.
Tupac Shakur released his posthumous album, The Don Illuminati, The 7-Day Theory, under the alias Machiavelli. The cover features a painting of Tupac himself nailed to a cross. He explicitly stated before his death that it wasn't meant to be disrespectful to religion. It was a desperate statement about race, the media, and the intense feeling of being persecuted as a young black man in America.
You have Madonna in her 2006 Confessions tour ascending from the stage on a massive mirrored cross wearing a crown of thorns. She utilized the shock value of the imagery to draw the world's attention to the millions of children dying of AIDS in Africa, challenging the church's response to the crisis.
But I think the ultimate example of how thoroughly this symbol has been detached from its origins is found in skateboarding. Think about Christian Hosoi. a legendary skateboarder in the 1980s. He invented a trick on the half-pipe where he launches himself massive air, grabs his board, and spreads his arms out completely wide in midair. He called it the Christ Air.
It is a breathtaking visual.
The symbol is so deeply embedded in the human psyche that an anime director in Tokyo and a skateboarder in California can both utilize the exact same physical geometry to communicate totally different concepts. Apocalyptic annihilation versus ultimate weightless freedom, and our brains instantly process the shape. We recognize the visual language immediately.
Which brings our historical mapping full circle. We have tracked the incredible chaotic journey of a single event across 2 millennia.
We started with a violent, deeply paranoid Roman prefect stationed in the dusty, rebellious province of Judea, who utilized a bloody piece of wood to maintain order. We tracked the earliest historical ink confirming the event, from Paul's letters written while the memory was still raw, to the objective Roman records of Tacitus and the carefully reconstructed journalism of Josephus.
We explored how theological frameworks, from the dualism of the 2nd century Gnostics to the divine sovereignty of Islam, completely reimagined the event. They denied the physical reality of the death to protect the supreme glory of the divine, insisting that God would never allow his messenger to be defeated.
We watched the visual representation of the event evolve. It started as a donkey-headed insult scratched into Roman plaster. Then it transformed into the sanitized, invincible king of the Byzantine mosaics. Then the culture shifted, and the woodcarvers of Germany introduced visceral agony, leading to Dali's mind-bending mathematical hypercube and Chris Burden's Volkswagen.
And we tracked the bizarre posthumous journey of Pontius Pilate himself. The ruthless, club-wielding bureaucrat who crushed protests was retroactively transformed into a holy, miracle-witnessing saint in the East and a cursed, storm-bringing demon in the West, before ultimately being utilized as a theatrical tool for political satire and dangerous prejudice in the Middle Ages.
It is the ultimate open-source symbol, endlessly adaptable to the needs of the culture holding it. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Something directly tied to the mechanics of your own life today. Think back to the image of Pontius Pilate that has permeated our culture. Think about the biblical scene of him sitting on his judge's chair, taking a bowl of water and physically washing his hands in front of the roaring crowd, declaring himself innocent of the blood of the man he was executing to save his own political career.
Whether that precise physical gesture actually occurred on the steps of the Praetorium, or whether it was a brilliant metaphorical invention by later writers attempting to shift the blame, the psychological impact remains exactly the same.
A single middle management bureaucrat's attempt to dodge responsibility 2,000 years ago became a universal, timeless idiom for moral evasion. We still use the phrase today, "I wash my hands of this." It means I know the outcome of this situation is wrong, but I refuse to accept the blame or the consequences for it. As you navigate the endless news cycles today, as you watch modern leaders, politicians, and corporate executives desperately evade accountability, spin the narrative, and try to keep their hands perfectly clean while authorizing ruthless decisions behind closed doors, ask yourself this. What seemingly mundane, calculated gestures of political spin happening right now will humanity still be repeating and judging in the year 4000?
It is a vital reminder that history is never just about the facts of the event itself. It is about who possesses the power to tell the story of the event and how that story is engineered to justify the actions and hide the guilt of the present.
Exactly. The machinery of history isn't a clean, logical equation. It's messy, it's violent, it's deeply human, and its echoes ring out for millennia. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you next time.